React is a JavaScript library, and therefore you will need a good understanding of some essential JavaScript fundamentals. So if your JavaScript is a bit rusty, then this section is for you. So we're going to review topics such as destructuring, the spread operator, template literals, ternaries, and asynchronous JavaScript with promises and async await. Now, one of the things we do all the time in React is to work with immutable arrays. And so we will spend some time with the important array methods map, filter, reduce, and sort. Now, if you already know all these things, then please feel free to just skip this entire section and move right to the next one. So let's start this JavaScript review section with the very important concept of destructuring. And as always, I will start by creating a new folder here, which I'm simply calling JavaScript review. And then we need to get our starter files from the GitHub repo that we downloaded already in the beginning of the course. So let's select script.js here from the starter folder. And then let's paste that into the project folder that we just created. And now to open up this folder, I will simply drag and drop this folder onto the VS Code icon right here, which then sets it as the project folder. And alternatively, if that didn't work for some reason, you can of course always open up a project folder simply by clicking here on open. Right? But anyway, let's open up our script.js here. And as we see, it already contains some starter data. So we have this array here, which contains 5 book objects. So we have one object for each book, which has a title, a date, and so on. So all the relevant stuff about books. And then also I created 2 functions down here. So this getBooks will basically simply return this data here. And then we have getBook by ID, which basically simply returns the book with the ID that we pass in here. All right. So again, this lecture is about destructuring. And to start, let's create a variable called books, which will simply be the result of calling getBooks. Now, in order to actually execute this code, we will now use a special extension for that, which is called Quokka. So just go ahead and download this extension, which will allow us to run some JavaScript code right inside of VS Code. So without us having to connect this script with some HTML file, for example. So very helpful. And then to start Quokka on this file, we can come to our command palette, which is down here, or simply you can use this keyboard shortcut. So you should actually memorize this because this command palette is really useful all the time. So to start Quokka now on this file, you just type Quokka and type it correctly and then start. So then it is this one. So start on current file, hit enter, and you see that immediately it opened this panel down here. So in this output tab, and also it activated this tool here on the left side. And so now this code is actually already being executed, but to see anything, we can, for example, simply write now this variable, so this books that we already have, and it will immediately print it down here to this kind of console. It will show up here on the left side, so in this extension here, in this tab, and also it shows right here inside this file. So this is actually really helpful, especially for smaller values. So when you have an object, it's easier to check it out here in the sidebar. So here we can now see this entire array and all the objects that are in there. Okay, and now with all the setup in place, let's actually quickly talk about destructuring. So destructuring is very, very useful all the time whenever we need to basically get some data out of an object or out of an array. So for example, let's say we needed the title and the author of a certain book. And to demonstrate this, let's actually use getBook here with some ID, for example, ID2. Let's also call it here just book. Okay. And now, again, if we wanted to take the title out of this book object, so let's say we wanted to create a new variable called title, we could do book.title, right? And now using the Quokka extension, we can see that the title is the Cyberriet or something like that, right? And indeed, if we go here to the book with the ID 2, then we get exactly that title, right? And of course, we can take other data out of this. For example, let's say we wanted the author as well. We would do book.author. And then here, let's just see that. Okay. And by the way, we can also simply do console.log, which will get a similar result. So again, this author here, but then we can do multiple at the same time, which can be a bit more helpful. Now, reading data from the book object like this can become a little bit cumbersome, especially when we have lots of properties that we need to take out. Then we would have to write one line of code for each of these properties. So that's really not ideal. And so that's why we have object destructuring. So with object destructuring, we can simply create these new variables all at once. So let's again say title and author. And right now, VS Code is complaining because we're already defining them up here, but never mind that for now. And so then here, we simply specify the object out of which we want to take the title and the author. And that's actually it. So let's comment out these two, and then we see that we get the exact same results down here. Now here, what's crucial is that we actually give these variable names here exactly the same name as the properties in the object. So if we had titles here, then that would not work. So you see that it would then be undefined here. And that's because there's no titles property in the book object. Okay, so really, really helpful all the time, especially whenever we get some data from an API, which is basically what we're simulating here with this getBook function. So this is, of course, not an asynchronous function, but it simulates that we're getting this book from some kind of API that's abstracted behind this function. And so then, once we get that data, usually as an object, we can then destructure all the properties out of there that we need. And actually, let's take out some more properties. Let's do pages. Let's do the publication date. Let's do the genres. I think that's what it's called. And then has movie adaptation. All right. So again, let's just basically log the book here so that we can have it here on this left sidebar. And so then here with this, we can easily see all the properties that are inside the book object. And so these ones are the ones that I'm taking out now, basically out of the book and storing them into their own variables. And so there's no need to log all of them here now. Okay, so this is how destructuring works in a nutshell for objects. There's actually some more stuff that we can do, but I will not go into that here. And instead, let's now move on to destructuring with arrays, which is pretty similar, but instead of relying on the property names, it simply relies on the order of the elements in the array. So for this example, let's work with the genres array. So we'll just lock it here so that we can see what this array looks like. So this is the array that we're going to work with, and it has all these 5 genres that the book belongs to. And so let's say that these genres right here are basically ordered by importance. And so the primary genre is this one is the secondary one, and these other ones are not that important. So let's say that we wanted to create a variable called primary genre. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but that doesn't really matter. So we could do genres and then taking out the first element, and then for the secondary genre, we could simply do this. Let's log it to the console, and here again I'm using that snippet that we defined in the previous section. Remember that? So primary genre and the secondary one. And so indeed we get science fiction and humor. But again, this can be done in a better way using destructuring. So let's using destructuring. So defining some variables, and then here instead of the curly brackets for the object, we use the square brackets, which is how we define arrays. Now here, primary genre and secondary, and then simply equal genres. Give it a save, and then here we have the exact same result. So basically, the first variable that we define here in this destructuring, will take the first element out of the array and assign it to this variable. And then here, of course, the second one. So it takes the second element out of the array and assigns it to this variable. And of course, we could keep going, but here we are only interested in the primary and in the secondary genre. So we take these two out of this array by using array destructuring. Now moving on, let's quickly learn about the rest and the spread operator. And let's go back here to this line of code where we did the destructuring in the previous lecture. So where we took out this primary genre and the secondary genre out of this array. And now let's say that we also wanted to get all the other genres, so the ones that are not the first and the second one, into another array. So basically into an array containing all the other genres. And for that, we can use the rest operator. So here we can simply write ... and then give it any name that we want. So let's say other genres. And so this will automatically create an array which contains all the values that we haven't previously destructured. So let's log that here. And indeed, here it is. So we took out science fiction and humor, which, remember, is the first and the second one, and then we got an array with the third, the fourth, and the last one. So exactly what we wanted. And of course, if here we didn't have this one, then these other genres would also contain the secondary genre. So then only primary genre would be right here, so would be this one, and then the other genres would be all the other ones. Now this is not what we want, so let's put it back. And now just one important thing about this is that we can only place this here in the end of the destructuring operation. So placing this like here wouldn't make a lot of sense. So this immediately gives us here an error saying that a rest element must be the last in the destructuring pattern. Okay, so let's again go back. And that's actually it for the rest operator. Now, what's a bit confusing about this is that the same syntax, so the 3 dots, is also used for the spread operator, which is a bit more common than the rest operator. So the spread operator, we use it actually all the time. It's really important and very common. And just like destructuring, we can also use it both on arrays and objects. And let's start to look here at arrays first. So let's say that we want to create a new array with all the genres, but add a new one to the end. So how could we do that? Let's say new genres. So we want a new array, as we said, right? Containing all the current genres and then another one at the end. So we could try to just add genres here, and then let's say epic fantasy. So let's see what that would get us. But immediately we see that this is not exactly what we wanted, because we now have an array which contains, of course, the epic fantasy, but then also another array. So we simply have the entire genres array and then the genre that we wanted to add. But this is not what we want. We want one array which contains all of these values here individually. So all of these 6 genres one by one, and not one array which contains 5 genres and then simply the other genre in the end. So what we can do is to use the spread operator. So the spread operator, as I said, has the same syntax. So we can simply write this here. And what this will do is to basically take all the values out of the array and place them here one by one. So you can imagine as if this would be converted into simply writing these genres here one by one. So taking them out of the array, placing them here. And so since we're building a new array here, we will then get this new array which contains all these individual values and at the end, epic fantasy. All right, so this is really, really helpful. And of course, we could also place it at the end, and then epic fantasy would simply be at the beginning of the new array. So just like this. Great. So this is how the spread operator works with arrays. But now let's move on to objects, where the spread operator is even more important because it allows us to add new properties and also to update existing ones. So let's create a variable called updated book. And let's say that now we wanted to create a new object based on the current book, but which has a new property. And that new property, for example, can be the movie publication date. So we already have a publication date property here, and we also have a movie adaptation. And so we can now also create a property which says when the movie was actually published. Now this book here doesn't actually have a movie, but that's not really the point here. That doesn't really matter. We're just learning how to do this. So let's try to create this updated book object just like we did before by using the current book object and then adding a property here saying movie publication date. And let's simply use this date. And this date is actually the publication of the movie of the first Lord of the Rings book, which I think is book number 1. And so let's, just to make this right, let's get the book number 1 here. So you see immediately everything updates here. So all these loggings that we have, all these genres here, of course. But what we're interested in here is the updated book, right? And again, to inspect this, let's open up here this sidebar. And just like before, this is really not what we wanted. So inside this book, we now have another book property, which contains the book itself, plus this new movie publication date property. So this is not what we want. Instead, we want one big object which contains all of this and this new property. And so the solution, just like before, is to simply spread out all the properties of this book object into the new object. And immediately you see how it updated here. And now everything is simply inside the updated book object. Great. So this is how we add new properties to an object using the spread operator. But as I said in the beginning, we can also use it to basically update properties. So by simply overriding them. So we see that we have this pages property, but let's imagine for some reason that it is wrong. And so we can simply override that here. So let's say the number of pages is actually 1210. So if we inspect that again, then you see that now it is actually 1210. And the reason that works is because, as I mentioned in the beginning, this syntax here basically takes all the elements, so all the properties of the object into this new object, and that of course will contain the original pages property. And so then we have two pages properties, and so then the second one, so this last one, will override the first one. So if we place this one first, which is perfectly valid, then you will see that it goes back to 1216, because then the pages property coming from right here is the last and will therefore then overwrite this one. So whenever we want to do this, the spread out original object needs to be first. So just writing out what we did here, adding a new property, and then overriding an existing property. And I'm focusing so much here on this because this is going to be really, really important when we work with React, because when we want to update objects in state, which you will learn later what that is, we will need to use this technique. And we will also talk about this a bit later again in this section. But for now, just keep in mind that when we want to create a new object and then add new properties to it or override existing ones, this is how we do it. So we use the spread operator. And the same is true for arrays. So very, very important. So it's fundamental that you know this as we go through the course. In this lecture, let's review template literals. So template literals are an ES6 JavaScript feature which allows us to very easily create strings that contain some JavaScript variables, or actually that contains any JavaScript expression inside of a string. So let's illustrate that by using some of these variables that we have created here in the beginning. So like some of these here about this book, in order to create a summary string of the book. So creating a string that contains a summary of the current book object. So let's create summary, and here is where we will have our string. Now usually strings in JavaScript are defined with normal quotes like this, or with double quotes, right? However, template literals are with these backticks. And if you're using an English keyboard, they are just above the tab key on the left side on the keyboard. So these backticks indicate to JavaScript that this is a template literal. So for now, let's just write anything here. And then I will immediately write it out here again so that Quokka can display the result of this variable here. And so for now, we see that this is still a normal string as if it had been defined with the normal quote. But now let's actually add some JavaScript expression in here. So for that, we use this $sign and then curly braces. So let's say title is a book, and indeed this title right here, or in fact any JavaScript that is in here inside of this block, is then replaced in the string with the value that this block basically returns. So the value that is created here. And so title is of course Lord of the Rings, and so then in the string we see the Lord of the Rings is a book. So let's try something else here. So as I was saying, any JavaScript expression works here. So we can do 2 + 4, or really whatever we want. We can call functions here, and really anything that is an expression. So anything that immediately produces a value can be placed here inside this block. Okay, but now let's create a little bit more of a nice looking string here. So let's say the Lord of the Rings is a book with a certain number of pages. So here we can use the pages variable, which remember we took out of the books object using destructuring. And so now you start seeing why it is so helpful, because otherwise we would have to write book.title, then here book.pages, and so on. So for all these variables that we're going to use here. So we say 1216 page long book was written by, now let's use the author here. And again, we took that one out using destructuring and published in, now here we can use our publish date, or actually I think it's called publication date. All right, so then here sometimes the string becomes a bit too long, and in that case I just like to scroll down here and see the output right here in this panel here on the bottom. And by the way, in case that your Quokka didn't open up this panel, you can always open it up by opening the terminal, which should be right here. So you can do a new terminal like this. And then you see that here you have the problems tab, the output tab, and then here you can just select Quokka. All right. So here we have this string now, and here we have the publication date. But here I just want the year. And so let's just take out the year. And so this is again to show you that we can write any JavaScript expression here inside these curly braces. So let's say we want to split this string by this dash, which will result in an array. And then from there, we just take the first element. So that's just standard JavaScript. And so now indeed, here we get a string as we want it. Great. And that's actually all I had to tell you about template literals. That's just how easy and straightforward they are, but we use them really all the time in React. So in React, we need to define values based on a condition all the time, and many times in situations where we cannot use an if-else statement. And so let's now learn how to use the ternary operator instead. So in JavaScript, the ternary operator is a very special type of operator that has 3 operands. So 3 parts that are needed for this operator to work. So let's work here on the pages value again. And so the first part of the ternary operator is a condition. So let's say pages greater 1000. So this is a condition. And if this is true, the result of this operator will be whatever is after this question mark. So let's define a string here, and let's say over 1000. Then let's add this colon, and for now I will just write another string here, and then I will explain what's happening. So less than 1000. So again, the ternary operator has 3 parts. The first part is this condition here. The second part is this second operand, which is the result of the operation in case that the condition is true. And in case that the condition is actually false, then the result of this operator will be this third part of the operator. Okay? And in case that is confusing, just remember that an operator is a bit similar to a function. So it always returns some value. So for example, if we have 2 plus 2, then the operator here is the 2, and it will result basically this 4, right? And this operator here, so the ternary operator, again, will return this value here in case that the first operand is true. So this condition is true. And if it's false, then this part here will be the result of the operator. And then we can, as always, store that result into a variable. So let's just call this the pages range. Let's log that here. And so our pages are currently 1210, which is of course more than 1000. And so then here we get that pages range is over 1000. And if we had another book, so if here a book was get book ID 2, well then our book still has 1210 pages because we are actually manipulating that value here, remember? But let's take that out, and then our book only has 295 pages, which will then result here in the string of less than 1000. And so then we can use this here, for example, to create another string. Let's log that to the console. And again, using a template literal, the book has pages range page. And so now we get the book has less than 1000 pages. Let's put this one here back. and go also back to book number 1. And then we get the book has over 1,000 pages. Great. So that's what we use the ternary operator for. So to define a variable conditionally. And let's just quickly do that here again, right here in the summary string, just so I can show you that we can really use any JavaScript that returns a value here in one of these blocks. So the book has, here will be our JavaScript block, and then let me just write the end, been adapted as a movie. And so here basically, if the has movie adaptation is true, then we want to return nothing, and if it's false, we want to return not. That makes more sense if we write it out. So has movie adaptation, which we can again use because we already took it out of the object up here in this destructuring. So if has movie adaptation, then return nothing. And if not, then return the string not. Okay. And well, that's a bit hard to see there. So the book has been adapted as a movie, which makes sense because this here is true. But once again, if we change this to number 2 here, then the book, then the book is different. It has no movie. And so then our string should say, the book has not been adapted as a movie. Great. So with this, we used a conditional right here inside the template literal. And it would not have been possible to use an if-else statement here instead, because an if-else statement is, well, as the name says, it's a statement. So it does not return a value. So it would have been impossible to use that here. And so then the ternary operator is exactly the way to go. And as I said in the beginning, we do this all the time in React. And so this is one of these things that is really important to know before starting to write React applications. In this video, let's quickly get ourselves familiar with arrow functions. So arrow functions are a new way of writing functions that have been introduced into JavaScript in ES6. And they are very helpful for writing quick and short one-line functions. Now, many people actually use arrow functions for all functions now, but I personally really don't like that, and I only find them useful for, well, as I said, these one-liner functions. So let's say that we want to write a function which automatically does this part here. So it takes in a value that is supposed to be a date and will get the year. So based on this convention that our dates are always written in this format right here. So date dash month dash day. So the, let's say, old way of writing that would be simply to use the function keyword. Then let's say get year, and it receives a string, and then we can return, just like we did up here. Let's actually copy this to make it a bit faster. And then we could use get year with, for example, the publication date that we already have. And so this results in 1965, just as we have here. So this is the traditional way of writing functions, which I still use all the time for longer functions, but now we also have arrow functions. So let's see how we write an arrow function. So the function is basically simply the argument, then the arrow, and then what we want to return, which is string.split, and then the first element. And that's it. This is a function. And maybe you noticed that the prettier extension that we're using in this course did automatically wrap this parameter here inside these parentheses. And that's because we can actually specify multiple arguments or parameters, and then we really need to use the parentheses. And so that's why Prettier placed them there, because like this, we cannot make any mistakes. So we could really pass any number of parameters here in that we wanted, And then based off those, we can then return something. So again, this part here is automatically returned without us having to write the return keyword explicitly. Okay, so let's just turn this one here off, because now we want to reuse this getYear name. Because right now, this is a function, but we cannot really use it because we haven't stored it anywhere. So we can just do this, const getYear, and then store that function value into this variable here. And so this then becomes a so-called function expression as well, while this one here is a function declaration. So that's a subtle difference that you might have heard about, and it's not really important. What matters is that this is an arrow function where we automatically return whatever is here on the right side of this arrow. Now, if we had more code here, so if we had multiple lines, then we would have to use a function block again. So using these curly braces, then we could write whatever code we needed here. And then in the end, we would actually have to manually return again. So this one would also work the same way. So you see that we have the result here. But if you use this block, then you really do need this return keyword again. Otherwise, as you see, it returns undefined. But again, the ideal way of using this function is when you really have just a one-liner, then you don't need a return keyword, don't need a function block. All you need is this. And this really becomes very useful for callback functions, for example, in some arrow methods, as we will see later. Now, let's actually use this here. So for that, I will cut this part and we'll place it here before the summary, because now I want to use the getYear function in here. So also delete this part. Actually, I cut it and put it here just as a reference. And now here, instead of doing it manually here, we can call the function right here inside of the template literal. So getYear, and again, publication date. And the result that we get in the console is indeed exactly the same. In this lecture, let's review how short-circuiting works with some logical operators. So in JavaScript, some logical operators, such as the AND and the OR operator, have a feature called short-circuiting. So short-circuiting in logical operators means that in certain conditions, the operator will immediately return the first value and not even look at the second value. And this probably sounds confusing, so of course let's write some code here. So starting with the AND operator, the AND operator short circuits when the first operand, so when the first value is false, and then will immediately return that first value. So let's use a console.log here, and let's do what I just said. So when the first value is true, the AND operator will automatically return the second operand, so the second value, no matter what that is. So let's say some string. And so indeed, immediately we get some string here. And so here we have no short circuiting. The short circuiting works in the AND operator when the first value is false. So here, if we have false, then there is a short circuit and the operator does not even look at the second value. So instead it immediately returns the first one here. And this can be quite helpful basically in order to use this as an if. So for example, we could do has movie adaptation and this book has a movie. And so here the operator, just like in this previous line, immediately returns this false value because as we can see here, has movie adaptation is false. And so the AND operator short circuits and doesn't even look at this other part here. But of course, if we go back to using the first book right here, then we get this book has a movie. So again, this acts a little bit like an if, right? And so sometimes in React, we use that to our advantage. And this also works with so-called truthy and falsy values. So a truthy value is basically any value that is not a falsy value. And the falsy value, let's just write that here, is 0, an empty string, null, and undefined. And I think there's actually one more, which I can't think of right now. So yeah, these are the ones that actually matter. So this one is not one of these falsy values, and therefore it's a truthy value, which means that for the AND operator, it is as if this was actually really a true value, because basically behind the scenes, this gets converted to true. And so, since this is true, we get the second value out of the operation. But if we use a falsy value, let's say 0, then we get that first one. So here once again, we have short circuiting in action because this is a falsy value. All right, so that's enough for the AND operator. Now let's go to the OR operator, which works exactly in the opposite way. So this one short circuits whenever the first operand is true and will then return it. So if we have true or some string, it doesn't really matter here the word, then we immediately get true. But if we have false, then we get some string. And so from this example, we can see that the short circuiting happens here in this case whenever the first value is true. So this is true, so the operator doesn't even look at the second value. Now we can use this here actually to our advantage in order to set default values. Let's try an example actually with the data that we're working with. And let's first look at book.translations.spanish. And so we get this Spanish string here. And that's because we have a Spanish translation for this book. But for the other book, again, book number 2, I think there is none. So yeah, it's undefined. And so let's say that we wanted to set a default value in case there is none. So we can use the AND operator for that. So let's say Spanish translation is book.translations.spanish or not translated. So the result of Spanish translation right now is not translated, because remember, this one was undefined, and undefined is one of these falsy values, right? And as we saw here, when the value is false or falsy, then the AND operator goes to the second part of the operator. So there's no short circuiting. And so here we are then using that to our advantage by setting this default string right here. And so this is then what will become the result of this entire operation, and then it will get assigned to this variable. And if the book was number 1, which I'm not going to do now, but yeah, you remember that it had a translation. And so then this here would become a truthy value, and then we would have short circuiting. So this one would not be evaluated, and then the value of Spanish translation would simply be this one. Great. However, this can also go wrong, because this works for all the falsy values, such as 0 as well. So sometimes that can have some consequences. So let me show you what I mean by that. So in book.reviews.library anything, and now .review count is 0. So each of these books has this reviews property, and there we have some reviews from Goodreads and from library anything or something. And so then in there, well, this one doesn't have anything. Or actually it does, but as you saw down here, that's only available in the Pro edition, which you have to pay. And so, yeah, inside reviews, we have Goodreads and library anything. And then each of those has a rating, rating count, and reviews count. But for this book number 1 that we're using right now, the reviews count for library anything is 0. And so let's use this value so I can show you that this can also go wrong. So this setting a default value. So count, let's call it actually count wrong. So book dot reviews dot library anything dot reviews count, or no data. So basically we want to get the reviews count, but if there is no value there, then we want it to be no data. So let's see what count wrong is. Well, it says no data, but we know that it is actually 0. So we would want the count to be 0 and not no data, because there is actually data, right? So for the book 1, for example, or any other book, there is this other number, so something that is not 0. And so here then the count wrong is actually correct. So here 452 is exactly what we want. But not when it is 0. So when this value is 0, it is a falsy value. And so when this is a falsy value, which 0 is, the result of this operation, so of this operator, will be the second part, which in this case is again wrong. Now to solve this, JavaScript has recently added a new logical operator, which is called the nullish coalescing operator. So a very weird name, but what matters is that it works very similarly to the OR operator, but it does also short circuit for falsy values. So let me show you what that means. So again, const, now let's just call it count, is equal to book.reviews.library anything.reviews count, and then question mark, no data. So here we have basically exactly the same, but instead of using OR, we're using the nullish coalescing. And so now the count will indeed not be no data, but will be 0. So this nullish coalescing operator will only return the second value when the first value is null or undefined, but not when it is 0 or an empty string. And I get that this sounds super confusing probably right now, but you will see in practice that this makes all the difference, and it is yet another nice addition here, this one, to JavaScript. Let's now take a quick look at the very important optional chaining operator. So remember how I said earlier that each book has this review field, and it has reviews from this Goodreads source and also from library anything. And notice how each of them has a different reviews count. And so in this lecture, we will want to create a function that gives us the total reviews count for each book. So that's going to be basically this one plus this one. Sounds very easy, right? And that's because it is. So let's quickly write a function that does that. So let's say get total review count for a certain book. So we pass in a certain book. Let's just do that immediately, just so we see how we use this function. Then, of course, our book. Here it could be called anything else, just B, for example, because, of course, this is simply the value that we are passing in. So let's create one variable for each of these review counts. So book.reviews.goodreads.review count. And then the same thing for this library anything. book.reviews.library anything.reviews count. And then we simply return one plus the other. So Goodread should be Goodreads plus this one. Okay, nice. Now we need to log this to the console as always. to get our result, which is 812. So that works beautifully for this book number 2. But watch what happens when we use book number 3. So let's wait for it. And actually the error pops up already up here. And so then nothing else is evaluated. So cannot read properties of undefined reading review count. Well, let's just take out all this code here. And so then the error pops up down here. So again, cannot read properties of undefined reading reviews count. So what this means is that this particular book, number 3, here in the reviews doesn't have the library anything. So it only has good reads. And therefore, this here will get undefined. And then we're trying to read reviews count out of undefined. And so that's, of course, then not possible. So again, the problem is that book.reviews.libraryAnything right now is undefined. So basically in JavaScript, this part will then get replaced by undefined. And then essentially we are reading undefined.reviewsCount, which of course doesn't exist. And then it results in this error right here. But fortunately for us, modern JavaScript has a solution for this, which is called optional chaining. And so with optional chaining, we can basically ask JavaScript to only keep asking here for these next properties in case that what comes before it actually exists. So here, instead of trying to always read reviews count out of this, we can just do it optionally. Well, not like this, but like this. So what happens now is that whenever this here is undefined, then JavaScript will no longer even try to read reviews count out of this. And so this is why we call this optional chaining. So the chain here only continues in case that this part here actually is not undefined or not null. So what happens now is that all of this thing here is immediately undefined. And therefore here we get this not a number. So the result here is still wrong, but at least we're not getting an error anymore. So right now it's not a number because this is some number, and then we're adding undefined, which we can confirm like this, right? And so, yeah, we get not a number. Therefore here we now need to set a default value. And this is why we learned about the nullish coalescing operator, because that one is actually perfect in this situation. So in this case, we simply say 0. So if there is nothing here, if there is no count for library anything, then it's just 0. So then we're just adding 0 to the value that we have from Goodreads, and then we get our final result. Okay, so again, what's happening here is that because of this optional chaining, JavaScript will no longer try to read reviews count out of this undefined thing here. So before we had undefined.reviewsCount, which of course did not exist and gave us an error. But with optional chaining, as soon as this here is undefined, the entire thing, so all of this, will automatically become undefined. And so then we use this nullish coalescing operator here to then simply give us 0 instead of that undefined right here. Okay, so this is helpful whenever we are not sure that all the values that we expect exist in an object. So before we had this here, we would have to first check if actually books.reviews.libraryAnything exists, and only then we could read reviews count out of that, which would really be a lot of work. Because, for example, let's say we're also not sure if even reviews.libraryAnything exist. So it would be even safer to do this also here, and why not also here? Because there might be some situation where maybe the book has no Goodreads reviews. So let's simply do this always. At least always we are not sure about the data structure of the data we are receiving. Now, before you can start building any meaningful React application, you need to be a true master of the 3 functional array methods in JavaScript, which are map, filter, and reduce. And I call them functional array methods because these methods do not mutate the original array, but do instead return a new array based on the original one. So in this lecture, let's start by taking a look at the map method. And to start, let's actually take out all this code here, because we do no longer need it now, because from now on, we will actually start working with the entire books array. So let me take that out, give it a save, and then here we have all this panel and this Quokka output here cleaned up a bit. So let's again pretend that we are getting our books from this fictional API using the getBooks function. So let's say get books, and so remember that this will then give us the entire books array. And so now we are ready to use the map method on that array. So what does the map method actually do? Well, basically the map method will loop over an array and return a new array with the same length with some operation applied to each of the elements of the original array. So just to illustrate that, let's say we have this very simple array, and on that we can call map. And so now map expects a callback function, which is a function that will be called for each of these elements of the array. And so now here these arrow functions that we talked about earlier become really handy, because now we can simply use an arrow function here, for example like this. And I will explain in a second what this does, but for now let's just take a look at the output here. Actually, let's save this in some variable. And so what you see here is that we get an array which is basically double the previous array. So what happened here? So again, we passed in this callback function, which is a function that gets called for each of the elements of this array. And in this callback function, the element parameter will always be the current element of the array. So for this first element here, L will become 1, and then here we simply return 1 times 2, which is 2. So that's then placed in the array, and we move on to the next one. So then here we have 2, so therefore element becomes 2, 2 times 2 is 4, and so that then gets placed in the array. And like this, it goes all the way until the end of the array. And so again, the map method is basically to create a new array based on the original array with some operation applied to each element of the original array. So this was just some demo here, but now what I want to do is to create an array that contains simply all the titles of all the books. So instead of having this huge array which contains all these objects, all I want is an array which simply has all the titles. So let's say titles equals books dot map, and now again our callback function. And here let's call each element a book, because well, we have this books array, which is well actually it isn't isn't anything, and that's because we have this error here. Let's just return something here so that the error ends. But yeah, this is not the books array anyway. Yeah, so here we have this array with all these objects. And so now as we loop over this array, each of the elements is one book object, right? So this is the argument to the function, and then remember is what we return. So what do we want to return? Well, simply book.title. And now as we check out what titles is, we see it is this array which only contains the titles. Beautiful. So that was pretty simple, right? So the operation doesn't, well, of course, have to be like a math operation like this. Here, simply what we return for each book element is book.title. And so that then gets placed into the array. So the new output array, which then gets stored into these titles. Okay, let's see another example. And let's say that we wanted to basically only get the essential data for each of these book objects. So we want an array with objects still, but now we only want like the title and the author, maybe. So let's say essential data should be books.map. And again, I'm calling each one the book. And now here, what we want to return is a new object, which contains, again, the title and the author. Now, in an arrow function, whenever we use these curly braces like this, the arrow function will think that this is a declaration block, right? So this is not returning an object. So if we wrote like x23, this would not be returning anything because, again, the arrow function simply thinks that this here is the function block. So we can solve this in two ways. First, we can simply then return the object from here manually. So we can now say title is book.title and author is book.author. Let's take a look at that. And yeah, that works. So now for each of the books, we only have the author and the title and nothing else. So that worked. So that's great. But yeah, here we have a bit too much code. So let's get rid of this return again. And so the trick is to simply wrap this here in a parenthesis. So we don't need any of this. And so now that works the same. And so by using these parentheses first, instead of the curly braces, then again, we are automatically returning this object from here. So just like here, we are returning the result of this operation, and here we are returning simply this value right here. And of course, we could also do some computations in here. For example, let's say we wanted the reviews count. And now here we could get back this function that we did before. Let's just copy that. And then let's just call get total review count for the current book. And so now, yeah, we get all of this data that we wanted. But again, it's just the essential data, just basically a small part of the total data that we had before in the books array. So these are just a few use cases that are going to become in handy for the rest of the React course. And if this was maybe a bit too fast, so if you didn't know this map method before and you didn't quite understand it yet, that's understandable because this was more of a crash course on this map method. And so if somehow it hasn't clicked for you yet, you can just check out the documentation on MDN, or of course you can also check out my complete JavaScript course, because there I explain it all in a lot more detail. But for this short introduction, this should be enough. And so let's now move on to the next important method, which is the filter method. So next up is the filter method. And as the name says, we can use the filter method in order to filter out some elements of the array based on a condition. So let's say that we want to create an array which only has books that have more than 500 pages. So let's say long books and then books.filter. Give it some more space right here. And now here the idea is the same thing as before. So again, we pass in a callback function which should return something. So again, each element of the array is a book. And now here, instead of returning the value that we want in a new array, we need to return a condition which will either be true or false. And if the result of that condition is true, then the current element will go into the filtered array. But if it's false, then it will get filtered out, basically. So let's see that in action. And let's say book.pages greater than 500. And that's already it. So let's put long books here, close down here. So long books should be this one. And we see immediately that the array only has a length of 3 now. So this one has 1216 pages, this one 658, and then here also more than 500. So it worked. And so let's now go again over this to see what actually happened. So just like in the map method, this function here, this callback, will be called for each element of the array. So let's then go through the array one by one. So this is the first element. And so here, then this condition will be executed. So book.pages greater than 500. And indeed it is. And so here, this function, this entire callback here will return true. And so if it is true, then that element goes into the new array. So into the new long books array. Okay, let's do the next one. Here we have pages only 295. And so then here in the second element of the array, this will become false. And if it's false, then the element is basically filtered out. It will not make it into the new array. Then filter moves on to the next one. Here we have 658, which we already saw here in the results. And of course, that's because it has more than 500. Here, this one is again left out, as it has only 200 and something. And finally, the last one, yeah, Game of Thrones is a long book. So that, of course, makes it into the long books array. Nice. Now we can actually keep adding new methods here. So after this filter, we can chain on another filter. And that's possible simply because this one here returns a new array. And on arrays, we can call filter, right? Therefore, we can call filter here again. And let's now say that we only want the books who have a movie adaptation. So out of these three, so book dot has movie adaptation. And that's already it, because this alone, so this has movie adaptation, is already a Boolean value. And so here we don't even need to write a condition, because all we need is to return either true or false, right? And so now long books, well, it's actually still 3. So it seems like all of these actually have movie adaptations. Yeah, that's right. So let's just put Dune here. So book number 3, let's put it to false, just to see what happens. All right. And now indeed, that movie also has been filtered out. So we just set Dune to false. And so now we only have here the Lord of the Rings and a Game of Thrones. So these are the only 2 long books which have a movie adaptation. So let's say long books with movie, right? Now this one here was just to show you that we can chain multiple filters. In practice, it would probably be better to just do an AND here, right? So that would be more efficient, but this one also works. So since this is so important, so again, we use this filter really all the time in React. This is really super important, this method. Let's do another one here. So let's only filter out adventure books. So not actually filtering out, but let's basically filter for adventure books. So that's a bit a better way of saying it. So books.filter, and again it will loop over the entire books array. And so let's do books, and then we're back to our genres array. So remember that this is an array, and now what we want is to include books in the array where the genres array includes adventure. So we're looking for adventure books, and so books.genres should include adventure. So includes always returns either true or false, and so right there we have our condition. Okay, so adventure books, but actually let's do something first. So let's again chain another method here, and this time let's actually chain a map. So that is also perfectly fine, because we already know that this here returns an array, and so then on an array we can always call map. So again, let's call it book, but of course it could be called anything that we wanted. So in all of these methods here, we called it book because that is what makes more sense semantically. But if we just called it X, like it would work the exact same way, right? So this is just a function, and we can call the parameter, so the argument that it receives, anything that we want. So here again, let's just return the title so that the output is a little bit easier to read. So the books that, or where the genres include adventure are The Lord of the Rings, Dune, and this Harry Potter book. And so if we check that out, then indeed, well, here we cannot see that. That's because of the Quokka limitation, where we cannot see so deep into the object with the free version. But I can assure you that, for example, The Lord of the Rings, so you see, here we have adventure, and so this book made it into the final array. This one does not, that's why it was not there. This one is also adventure, and so is this one. Somehow Game of Thrones is not an adventure. Not sure why that is. But yeah. So this is how we combine a filter and a map in an effective way to model our data exactly in the way that we want it. And so since front-end development with React and really any other front-end framework is really a lot about working with data, these methods here are absolutely essential. All right, so we tackled the map and the filter method, and so now it's time for the one method that rules them all, which is the reduce method. So the reduce method is really the most versatile and the most powerful of all array methods in JavaScript. So in fact, we could probably implement all the other methods simply using the reduce method, but that would be a little bit too much work. And so that's why we have all of these other methods, which are a lot easier to use. So I will really not go deep into the reduce method here because, well, we could spend hours just with this method, but I will just show you one of the most common use cases, which is to add together numbers, or basically to perform any operation or mathematical operations with numbers. So let's say that for some reason we wanted to read all of the books in the array, and we wanted to know how many pages we would have to read. So the solution is to add together all of these pages properties of all of the books in the array, right? And so for that, we can use the reduce method. So let's say pages, all books, and then books.reduce. Now the reduce method also takes in a callback function, which will be executed for each element of the array, and as a second argument, it also takes in a starter value, basically. But before we go into these, let's actually understand what the reduce method does and what it's used for. So it is called the reduce method because the goal of reduce is to reduce basically the entire array to just one value. So to boil it down. And if you think about it, this is exactly what we are trying to do now. So we want to boil down the entire array to just one number, which is in this case the number of pages of all the books combined, right? And so that second argument that I mentioned earlier is basically the starter value for that final value that we want to obtain. So first we will want to pass in a function. We will do that in a minute. And second, we want that starter value. And in this case, since we are adding together all of these values, we will start from 0, of course. It makes sense, right? And now here, let's talk about the function that will get called. So before we always had this callback function with a book, and then here we did something, right? But here, the callback function will be a little bit different. So the function that we pass in here will not only get called with the current element, but also with the current value of the accumulator, which starts at 0. So that all sounds very confusing, but let me just call this here ACC, which stands for accumulator, and then we will see in a second why this makes sense. So here, what we want to return is this accumulator plus book dot pages. And now if we say pages all books, then we get this huge number. Okay, so let's understand what happened here by going over this array element by element. So the first element, again, here is the Lord of the Rings. And so in this first iteration, this book here is of course this one. But what is the accumulator? Well, the accumulator is basically the current value of the final value that we want to boil the array down to. So basically, in this case, the pages of all the books combined, which starts at 0. And so in the first iteration, the accumulator will still be 0. So this function here will get called for the first element, and then the accumulator will be 0, and the book will be the current book. And so then we add together the current accumulator, so the current pages, all books, so to say, which is still 0, plus these 1216. And so we can imagine that the second value here then becomes 1216 after this first iteration. And so therefore in the next iteration, when we go to the second object, the current accumulator is already 1216. So here again, it will in the second iteration be already 1216, and then on top of that, we add 295. So that's then the current book pages. And so then in the next iteration, the accumulator will already be 1216 plus 295, which is like 1500 something. And then on top of that, we add this number of pages. And so it goes all the way until the end. So we can imagine this accumulator here basically as a pile onto which we put more and more and more until in the end we reach the final result that we were looking for. So it's like an intermediary value, in this case, onto which we keep adding the number of pages until in the end we reach 3,227 pages. Okay, so that was a bit confusing once again, but it's also not super important to understand how it works, especially if all we're doing is like this simple adding of numbers. So this always works the same in the end. And so yeah, the most important use case usually of reduce is just this. But we can also do very, very complex things, as I said in the beginning, because this initial value here doesn't have to be a number. It could also be an array, or it could be an object. And so what this means is that we could do really anything that we do with map or filter also with a reduce. But I won't go into that right now because yeah, for that we have already map and filter. Now here I just like to, in this case, to replace the accumulator value with sum. So calling it just sum because that is what it's actually doing. But just keep in mind that, well, it is an accumulator because we keep adding up and up and up onto this temporary value, so to say. In this case, it's simply the sum of the pages. And so here I like to then call it sum. Okay, and that's actually all I had to show you here about reduce, because yeah, many times we just use it for simple stuff like this. And so now you know how to do that. And now the last array method that I want to quickly talk about, because we also use it quite frequently in React applications, is the sort method. And as the name says, we can use this method to sort an array. So let's start with a small demo array, basically. Let's just give it a few numbers. And let's here create a new array based on that array. So x.sort, and here we need to pass in a function with 2 arguments. And we usually just call them a and b. And I will actually not really go into how this algorithm and how this method works here. But let me just tell you that in order to sort this array in an ascending way, we do A minus B. Okay, and now let's... Oh, and actually we cannot do this because we already used that apparently before. Okay, and now let's take a look at sorted. And indeed, it is now sorted in an ascending way. So starting from the lowest number all the way to the highest. Now, very, very briefly, what happens here is that basically JavaScript goes over the array, so it loops through it, and it calls this function here. And A and B are always the current value and the next value. And then here in the callback function, when we return a negative value, then these two numbers will basically be sorted in an ascending way. So the small number will come first, and then the biggest number will come afterwards. And if we do the opposite, so if we return a positive number, then, well, the opposite will happen. And these two values will be sorted in a descending way. And so we return these positive or negative numbers simply by subtracting one minus the other. So here A and B in this example will be 3 and 7. And so then 3 minus 7 is minus 4. And so, yeah, they will then be sorted in an ascending way, as I said before. But that's not really important. You should just basically follow this as a recipe. So when you do A minus B, it will be sorted in an ascending way. When you do B minus A, then descending. So indeed now we start with 9 and with 1. Now what's very surprising about the sort method is what happens when we now check out R. So R itself has been sorted as well, right? So it also now starts from 9, ends in 1, and if we switch this around, then you see that both these arrays are exactly the same. So what happened here? Well, what happened is that unlike the map, filter, and reduce method, this is not a functional method. So this is actually a method that mutates, so it changes the original array. And so we actually didn't even have to store this in a new array, right? Because it already changed this original array anyway. However, usually we do not want that to happen, especially in a front-end framework like React, which really does not like us mutating data. So a nice trick that we can do here is to first take a copy of the array simply by doing array.slice and open and close. And so this will then basically return a brand new array, which is a copy of this one. And so then on that array, we can chain the sort method. And so you see that with this, the sorted is still the sorted array, but R is now back to being the original one. So now it's not been affected because before sorting, we took a copy and then we sorted only this copy, but not the R itself. Okay, but now going back to a more practical examples, because rarely we have an array like this that we need to sort, but usually we always have an array of objects. So that's very common that we have to sort that. And so let's say sorted by pages. So as you can imagine, we will now sort the entire books array by the number of pages. So books.slice, again, very important to take a copy here. Then here we just follow that recipe. So AB, and let's say we want a descending one. And so then we say B, but now it's not just B minus A, right? Because these are now the two book objects. And of course we cannot subtract those. So we need still a numeric value here. And since we want to sort by pages, we do b.pages minus a.pages. And now sorted by pages. And cannot really see that there. Let's close all of these. So we start with Lord of the Rings, which has 1200 something, then 800, 600, 200, and then the shortest one is Harry Potter with 223 pages. So that worked perfectly. Let's do the opposite just to be sure. And yeah, so now Harry Potter is the first one in line, and yeah, it's now sorted in an ascending way. So we do this all the time. And so now when I do this inside the React course, I will no longer need to explain what we're doing and will simply follow this recipe. In React, many operations need to be immutable. So operations where we do not manipulate the underlying data structure. And so therefore, it's quite important to know how to add element to arrays, how to delete elements, and also to update elements, all without mutating the original underlying array. Now, these techniques that we're going to learn here are absolutely essential for React development. But the good news is that they always work in the same way. And so if you understand here how it works, then you will be well prepared for the rest of the course. So, as I mentioned, what we want to do here is to learn how to add elements, how to delete elements, and how to update elements of an array without changing the original one. And so once again, we are going to work with our array of books. So an array of objects, which really is the most common thing, so the most common data structure that we're going to find when we work with data on the front end. So let's say first add a book object to array. Let's start by creating this new book object here actually. So this one is going to be the number 6 here. The title should be Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. Secrets. Well, it's still wrong. And then the author is J.K. Rowling. So we already have one Harry Potter book in the array. And so now here we add another one. And in fact, we did already learn how we create a new array based on an original array and then adding some other element. So we talked about that right at the beginning of this section when we talked about the spread operator. Remember that? So let's say books, then after adding, let's say, or after add. And so all we need to do is to spread all the books here into this newly created array and then simply add another book, so another object. And then if we take a look at this right here, you see that now we have 6 of them and the last one is this one that we just created. And again, we could add this also to the beginning. So right here, but it's most common to simply add a new book right to the end of the array. So this one was quite easy. Now let's delete a book. So delete a book object from array. So again, this is always going to work in the exact same way, no matter how the objects look like, well, as long as they have an ID, which they usually have. So now let's create a new array again. So always new arrays. We need always to not mutate anything, but create new arrays. Now, in practice, these operations would be abstracted away into some functions. So for example, we would create a function called add book and delete book and update book instead of creating all these arrays like this. But of course, this is just to illustrate the idea and the technique. All right. So books after delete will be a new array after deleting one of the book objects. So we will basically now create a new array based on books after add, which we just created. And now we are going to use one of our array methods. And so let's together think about this. So we want to delete a book. And so after deleting, the array will be shorter than before. And so which of the array methods makes an array shorter than it was before? Well, that's right. It's the filter array, right? So when we filter out something, then the new array will be shorter. So let's filter. And once again, each element here is a book. And so in this case, let's say we want to delete the book with the ID number 3. And so we can say book.id is different from 3. And that's actually it. Let's take a look at that. So this one has ID 2 and the next one has number 4. So 3 is no longer there. Great. So why did this work? Well, because of what we already learned before. So whenever this condition here in the callback returns a false value, then that object will not be in the final array. So if we want to delete the book with the ID 3, basically what we want is to include in the final array all the books where the ID is different from 3, right? Because again, whenever this condition here is actually true, the object will end up in the final filtered array. And so the easiest way of thinking about this is to actually write a condition which does place the objects into the new array. And so again, that happens whenever the book ID is different than 3, because when it is 3, we want to delete it. And so yeah, that's exactly what happened here, as we saw here in the result. Great. And yeah, again, we would usually create a function called deleteBook, and then that function would receive this ID here, and then here we would simply use that ID like this. But here we're simply like manually deleting the one with the ID of 3. So again, just to illustrate how it all works. And so now let's, in the final stage, update a book object, well, in the array. So books, let's say after update, and we're going to do it on the books after delete. So it's like chaining all of this here one after another, but we're storing the intermediate result inside variables. And again, let's think about what array method we need here. So after updating one of the book objects, the resulting array should have the exact same length as before, right? And so which method produces an array which has the same length as before? Yes, that's the map method. So map is our choice whenever we want to update an object that is inside an array. Okay, so here we now need our ternary operator, because we, of course, don't want to do anything for most of the books. We only want to update exactly one book object, which is the one with the ID that we're looking for. So let's imagine we want to update the book with the ID of 1. Then let's say book.id, if it is 1, then return an updated object, which for now let's just write an empty object temporarily. But if not, well, then simply return the book as it is, so without any changes. And that's simply book, right? So let's already look at the result here, just to see that something happened. So again, we are trying to update the book with the ID of 1. And so now this one here is indeed just an empty object, because this was the one where book ID was equal to 1. So it was equal to 1, and so therefore, then what was returned from this callback function was this empty object, which is what we see here. But for all the other ones, it simply returned the original object. So then nothing changed. All right, but of course, we don't want to return this empty object, but we want to return an object which has an updated property. And In fact, we already learned how to do that way back, again using the spread operator. So remember, we simply spread out the current book object into this object, so this newly created object. So we take basically all of the properties into this new object, and then we can simply overwrite one of them. Let's say we want pages, again 1210. Let's just do something a bit more dramatic just to see the result a bit better. And so, yeah, now we have only one page here, while everything else, again, remains unaffected. Let's put it 1210, and there we go. So we updated one property in one object of the array. And this is, again, something that we do all the time. And so you just basically need to memorize this recipe right here. So when we want to add a new object to an array, we do this. We create a new array, spread the current elements, and add the new element. When we want to delete one, we use filter, because filter makes the resulting array shorter. Then we simply keep all the book elements, so all the book objects where the ID is different than the one we want to delete. And to update, we use the map method, because the map method creates an array which has the exact same length as the original. And so then when we are at the ID that we're looking for, so that we want to manipulate, then we create a new object and overwrite the property that we want to manipulate. And for all the other books, we simply return the book unchanged. So to finish this section, we're quickly going to review how we can use asynchronous JavaScript techniques in order to fetch data, so to load data from an external web API. And the first way in which we're going to do this is to directly use the concept of promises. And let's start by deactivating all this code that we no longer need. So now we're actually going to leave this domain of books, and we'll just focus quickly here on something entirely different. So in order to fetch data from an API, in the browsers, we have the so-called fetch API. So a function that is called fetch, and into which we can pass a URL of an API. And let's actually use a kind of dummy API that you commonly see in tutorials. And that's the JSON placeholder API. Yes, it doesn't matter. So just Google this JSON placeholder. All right, and then open up this this page, and then we can just copy this URL right here. So /todos, but without the one. So that's not necessary. And immediately here, you also see that they are using the fetch function, right? So let's create a new string like this and then paste in that URL. Now, in order for this to actually work in Quokka right here, you need at least version 18 of Node.js installed on your computer. So if you didn't do that previously, when I mentioned that you should use version 18, then this is a good time to update your Node.js version, because Quokka here actually isn't using a browser, but it is using Node.js. And the fetch function was only added to Node in version 18. Okay, but anyway, what is going to happen here when this function gets called? Because fetching the data from this API here, so from this string, will of course take some time, because JavaScript needs to do an HTTP request, needs to wait until that request is processed, and then it needs to download that data basically from this server. And so in the meantime, JavaScript actually keeps running. So if we log something to the console here, Jonas, for example, it will get executed immediately. So JavaScript will not wait until this data is fetched. It will simply execute this function and will then immediately move on to the next line of code, which in this case is this one. So how do we basically wait for this code here and do something as soon as the data has arrived? Well, that's where the asynchronous JavaScript techniques come into play. So this fetch function here, what it returns immediately, and then moving on to the next line, is a so-called promise. And we should be able to see that with a console.log here. Let's see. And indeed, so this is a so-called promise. And it says here that it's pending because that's one of the multiple states in which a promise can be. So it can be pending when it's still doing something in the background. It can be rejected if there was an error, in this case, if there was an error fetching this data, or it can be fulfilled, which means that the data successfully arrived. And once again, I will not go deeply into the details here. For that, you can go ahead and read the promise documentation on MDN, or you can watch some YouTube video, or you can, of course, also check out my complete JavaScript course. But anyway, the promise state that we are interested in here is the fulfilled state, right? So that's the state where the data has actually arrived. And we can handle that state by using or by adding the then method. So let's, of course, first get rid of this console.log. And so then, again, this returns a promise. And on a promise, we can call the then method. And so the then method will basically be called as soon as the promise is fulfilled. So as soon as it successfully got back with the data. Now, promises are used for more than data fetching, but here I'm just using that as an example, okay? Now, into this then method, we need to pass in a callback function, which is basically the code that will then be executed as soon as the data has arrived. So JavaScript will call this callback function here with the response that it has received. So that's why I like to call this here res. And this data then needs to be converted from JSON to a JavaScript object. So again, not going deep into it here. And here it just needs to be res.json. Okay. And now the thing is that actually doing so will return another promise. So this .json here also takes some time. So it's also an asynchronous operation. And therefore, here we need to add another then. Okay. But then here we already have our final data in the JavaScript form. And so this function here will then get called with the result of this previous function, which is then the data. So let's simply log this data then to the console at this point. So let's see. And indeed, here we got the to-dos. So there's a lot of them. All of them came through the JSON placeholder API. Now what you notice here again is that it first printed Jonas to the console, so the result of this, and only later is when this array of to-do objects was finally printed to the console as well. And again, that's because this data arrived later. So what happened here was that, as I mentioned before, is that this fetch function fired off a request to the API. And then immediately JavaScript moved on to the next line, which is this one here, where it simply basically registered this function here to be executed later. The same here, and then it immediately executed this line of code, right? Then some time passed, and then the data from the API arrived. And so then JavaScript goes back here and executes this callback function that we had registered before. And so this is where the response arrives. It's converted to JSON, and then here we receive the data in this callback function and log it to the console. So literally, JavaScript will wait until it executes these functions here, which is usually not how JavaScript works. But here we are using asynchronous JavaScript, while usually JavaScript is a synchronous language, where one line of code is simply executed after the other. Okay, and here now at this point, you could do something a bit more meaningful. For example, in React, we would then typically take this data and set some state, which would then get reflected right in the user interface. But of course, more about that later. For now, I just wanted to basically show you or to review how we use these promise methods here in order to successfully handle the moment when the data arrives from the API. So, in the previous lecture, we learned how to handle fetching data using promise methods. But in this lecture, let's take it one step further and learn how to do the exact same thing with a much nicer and cleaner syntax called async await. So, this syntax that we just learned here works really well, but it's not the most easy thing to work with, I would say. It's not the most beautiful code in a way. And so we can basically implement this logic here in a different way using async functions in the await keyword. Now, everything I explained to you in the previous lecture is still 100% valid, and the whole idea behind promises doesn't go away. The only thing that's going to go away is these then handlers right here. So we're going to, again, do it in a cleaner way. So now, instead of just doing it like this, let's create an async function. So that's simply a function with the async keyword before it. And then let's call it or get to-dos. Okay, then let's just grab this part here, and I will actually now comment all of this out here. Okay, and so now we can, inside the async function, await this. So await this promise immediately right here. And what will happen then is that actually inside this async function, JavaScript will not immediately move on to the next line like it usually does. So as I explained in the previous lecture, JavaScript by default will always immediately move on to the next line. It never waits for anyone, basically. So here, as we fetch, it will then immediately move here, and move here. It will, of course, not execute these callback functions, but it will basically register them. That's not really important, but what is important is that we saw that immediately this code here was logged to the console. So way before the data from the API actually arrived. But now, with the await keyword inside the async functions, for the first time in JavaScript, we do actually have a way of stopping and of pausing the code inside a function. And by doing this, it makes the function looks a lot more normal again and a lot more like normal synchronous JavaScript code. Because then we can very simply store the result of this here into a variable. So let's again call it response, and it's the exact same name as before. So here we call the response a res inside this callback function because, well, the response of the fetch is the data that is passed into this callback. So basically the response is this res. So here we can immediately and directly call it like this in a way that is a lot more legible and a lot more easy to understand. And the same thing then with the data. So we can immediately call it data and then simply await res.json. And then we can log it to the console. Just like this. And then we can call that function out here. And there we go. So here we get all this data that we had before again. But of course, that waiting only works inside this async function. So if here we again logged Jonas to the console, you would see that Jonas, of course, needs to be logged again before. Because, well, JavaScript here simply defines the function, then it arrives here, it calls the function, and immediately it moves on to the next line. But this function here, while being executed, does actually wait, but only here inside this async function, and only in the lines that have this await keyword. So what do you think would happen if we actually would try to return something from here and store it into a variable? So like returning these posts. Well, that's not correct. Well, actually, yeah, data, it's called data right here. Now let's try to store that here into some variable. So to-dos equal get to-dos. So what do you think would be logged to the console right here? Well, we can see it here. It is a promise. So what's going on here? Well, it's the same thing as before. Right after this function is being called, JavaScript immediately moves on to the next line. It does not wait. And so at this point here, JavaScript has no way of knowing yet what these to-dos are going to be. And so simply to-dos is a promise, which means that the result value of this async function is always just a promise. And this is a fundamental piece of knowledge that you need to have in order to work with async functions and with asynchronous data in general in JavaScript. Because now if you wanted to actually get these to-dos out here, you would again have to use the then method on here, or you would have to use another async await function. Now you have another promise in your hands here that you need to handle. But fortunately for us in React, that's not very common, because usually what we want as soon as we receive some data is to set the state. So that we would do immediately here in this async function, and then we wouldn't usually return anything here. So this was just, again, showing you the synchronous and asynchronous nature of JavaScript. So if you want to understand this a bit better, then you can go ahead and compare these two solutions here, which achieve the exact same thing, and see how they are different, and how, at least in my opinion, this one is a lot nicer, because it looks, again, like a normal function, while this one here does not really. So here you can easily store the result of the awaited data immediately into some variables, and then use them in a flow that looks just like synchronous code. Now, okay, and with this, we actually finish our review of essential JavaScript for React section. So hopefully this brought you up to speed with all the JavaScript that you need to know to be able to now successfully complete this course. And so now the time has actually come to really move on to the actual complete and ultimate React course.